Representative Galaviz, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm doing swimmingly. We're talking education again. Education is the hot thing this session so far. I don't know of anything else that's been as dominating and pulling the oxygen out of the room.
Sure. Last couple sessions, it seems like. Yeah.
Last session, but they didn't bring forward a school choice last session, did they?
Oh, sure they did.
They did?
Right.
Who? Well, I missed this. I'm sorry. I wasn't following as closely last year. Who brought forward a school choice one?
So there was Representative Hormit and Senator Den Hartog brought a version of the tax credit that they brought this year as well last year.
Oh,
it just
gotcha.
couldn't get out of rev and tax, so it's sort of
It didn't make it.
right.
Gotcha. Well, they brought another one, as did like a bunch of other people, and here we are. But one big question that people have, and you are a school teacher, you're a big education advocate, public education advocate. But one thing people have talked about is, look, we have a state constitutional obligation. Like this is reality. We have a constitutional obligation to provide free public education for people. And I just spoke with actually Dr. Julie Yamamoto, who's a former representative, and she was the chair of the House Education Committee last year, talking about like, look, she said, look, there's nobody that's going to say all of our public schools are perfect at this point. Like, that's just not reality. We always have things to improve on, which is great. But before we start funding and engaging in other systems, people have been saying we need to fulfill our whole constitutional obligation right now to our existing public schools. Now, whether or not we get like 99% of the way there or 99.9%, sure. But there are large systemic problems, specifically with funding, facilities and whatnot, that we're experiencing right now in more rural areas of Idaho, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, we have a 2005 Idaho Supreme Court ruling that talked specifically to that and talked about the Idaho Constitution and our obligation to fund a general, uniform, thorough system of schools. And they said, and including your facilities. And that court ruling actually said it's not the court's job, it's not the local school district's job, it is the state's job to fund thoroughly those facilities, and we are falling short.
Talk to me about this, because we have, my kids are in the West Ada School District, and they have problems with their facilities. It's nothing crazy, but I've heard of really extreme cases where you just don't have basic functions even within areas. And I mean, the classic one is the broken sewer line underneath the cafeteria, and people just having to deal with things of that nature until they could get the astronomical sum to redo the sewer line.
Sure. So you're talking specifically to the Salmon School District, which had multiple years, almost a generation worth of applying for going to their community for a bond, right? So we know that bonds have a 2/3 voting threshold, so 60% has to vote in favor of it, and they just could not make it happen, and the school continued to decline. I mean, it was literally sinking underneath them. And so they're a great example of a community who has done everything they can. They have had personal, donations. They have folks donating time, equipment, and they went to the community and had a grassroots effort and were able finally, after like 13 bond attempts, to pass a bond for $20 million, which does not get them all the way there. They had several donations. They have done fundraisers. They've done things like adopt a classroom, trying short of standing on the corner with a tin can for donations from people that drive by through the highway. They are still $3 million short to their goal. So they are still actively raising money and trying to figure out how to close that gap to be able to get that new school.
Okay. I've heard this explained once before. I don't understand it. Okay. So we have a constitutional obligation for the state to fund our schools and the facilities that those schools exist in, the whole bit.
Right.
Okay. But we somehow allow or put the burden on communities to decide whether or not to fulfill that, what appears to be a very substantial portion of that constitutional obligation. Like, we have a constitutional obligation through like law and order, right? To like provide police services and whatnot.
Sure.
But we don't go to communities and say, hey, did you want to pay for those, please? Because if you don't, like, we're good with it. Like, whatever. Like, can you help me understand, like, when did we make this transition to going to the taxpayers and the individual communities and being like, hey, I know we, the state, have an obligation, but we're going to go ahead and just like let you guys iron this one out?
Sure. So it has always been the obligation of the local communities to be able to build a school. So we do that through bonds. I tell people, when you hear bond, think buildings, right? Bonds are for buildings, either
levies are for learning, for teaching.
Yeah, gotcha. Operational staff, things like that. So with our bonds, as of last year, the 23-24 school year, we had almost $500 million that were actively out of in school districts for bonds and levies. So taxpayer burden, right? That increases property tax locally to be able to pay for the bond or the levy that they've gone for. So where we have a discrepancy that we've got to figure out is the bonding capacity and the will of the people in local communities. So the way bonding capacity, if a school district's going to go for a bond, they can bond for up to 5% of the total assessed value in the taxing district or their school district. So for Boise, for example, that's a lot of consolidated market value, right? Property value. So their 5% is up to $2 billion that they could bond for. Now, they would never bond for that much because folks couldn't afford it, and they surely would not vote for it.
But that's their capacity.
That is their capacity. That's that 5%. Post Falls is 466 million. So there's another, like a district from the north. North Gem, which is in Bancroft, which is in eastern Idaho, they have a $10 million bonding capacity. So they're a really good example. They need a new school. Your base level, no bells and whistles, not the Taj Mahal.
It's like, give me 4 walls and a flat roof.
$30 million with inflation right now. Their bonding capacity is $10 million. So you tell me, how is the community going to fund a school? Even if all the community agreed, right? They're like, we're going to vote for it, 2/3, no problem, we pass it. They don't have the capacity to go for more money. They can't afford it. Plus, we haven't even talked about the actual tax burden for Caribou County has less than 8,000 people, I think. It's not possible. So it's that delta between what they can go for, what the community can afford, the individual tax burden, and what is the state's obligation to help them with a new school.
Okay, and that's my question. What is the obligation? Say you have, and what was this last place you were talking about?
North Gem.
Okay, so say in North Gem, they're like, all right, look, here's the deal. We have a school that has like a 50-person capacity, because in Idaho, we actually have like one classroom schools where like the superintendent is the teacher and blah, blah, blah. And, kids ride like snowmobiles to go to class. So let's say it's 50 people, right? 50 kids. And they're like, we have facilities for this 50 kids, but we got 100 kids now, right? Either families moved in or, it doesn't take a lot to double from like you got 10 families with 5 kids each. Like that's not that unthinkable. They don't have to get another building that can manage the double capacity. That's going to cost millions of dollars, right? Like you're just building something basic. What is the state's obligation in that world? Or is it like, no, we never have a constitutional obligation to physically build the property in which the schooling happens? That's always on you. So we don't actually, is it the case that we don't actually have an obligation to provide schooling in that regard? We only like enrich the schooling once the building is built?
No, we absolutely have an obligation to provide support for those facilities. So that was the Supreme Court ruling in 2005. And
okay, so what is happening? I don't understand. Like, if it's like, hey, we need a new building.
Sure.
We have these kids, like our community physically cannot.
Right.
Like, when does the state step in and be like, oh, wait, here we go. I'm going to sprinkle some like funding or dust for like I'm going to grow a building.
Okay. Well, here's the issue. So for a long time, we have not had a facility assessment across all of the schools. In 2020, 2021, the state directed, OPE, Office of Performance Evaluation, to do an evaluation of like, what's going on in our schools? What's the need, really? And because we didn't have a uniform assessment, it was hard to tell where the most need was. They had calculated, 4 or 5 years ago, that we had over $1 billion in deferred maintenance. But as a requirement of House Bill 521 that passed last year, which put that $1 billion, right? They bonded $125 million, $1 billion to distribute to all the districts. As a requirement of that, they required that all schools submit a facility assessment. So we had the same metric, we had the same software, and the same instruction to all the school districts of 42 points of assessment on all of their systems, whether HVAC, plumbing, foundation, whatever. So that assessment went ahead and kicked out, here's the need for school districts immediately, 0 to 5 years, what they need replaced right now. And then it went 5 to 10 years and then up to 20 years, which is when you start to look at life cycle of buildings. So just for the 0 to 5 year window, and this is like immediately replaced, we've got to whatever it is, HVAC, plumbing, etc. We're looking at $2 billion across every district, 115 brick and mortar public schools. So there's your problem, right? Where it's not that the state doesn't have a desire, I would hope, right, to address this issue, but the magnitude of it and the system that we have in place right now is not working. We can't meet the financial obligation, the need across all the districts without doing something different with either our distribution model or actually looking at what are the needs first before we distribute money.
Okay. So the state comes up with a pool of $1 billion, and that will be directed to the school districts in some manner, whatever that manner is. Now, it's insufficient. Okay. Billion's a start. I like chopping things in half. Sure. So is it that the school districts ever have to pay that back? Is it that the taxpayers of that area? So like say West Ada, right? And I think they got like $100 million or like $150 million. Okay. Will the residents of West Ada ever have to pay that $150 million back to the state after it distributes it?
No.
Okay. So this is really like the state stepping up and saying,
correct,
okay, we're going to try to fulfill our obligation. Now, again, insufficient because
right,
we need 2 billion, not 1 billion.
right.
And how does that money get doled out?
So that's a great question, because when we think of $1 billion going out to schools, that's not insignificant. That's it taking a huge bite of this problem, but it's being distributed on average daily attendance. So those districts that have a higher school population, West Ada is the largest school district in the state, right? They've got 40,000 kids, which is bigger than a lot of our counties. So they get the most amount of money because it's distributed on attendance. So they get about $150 million, a little bit more. Any distribution through either 521 or the other big bucket of money was created in 2023 from House Bill 292, which was meant to buy down their existing bonds and levies. So it's being distributed to be property tax relief for our counties, for our cities, because it's going to buy that down if they have an existing bond and levy.
Okay. And I'm sorry.
Nope.
So so the state distributes money and they're like, hey guys, take this $150 million and the bonds that you have on your books right now, pay that stuff off. Exactly. So it'll be effectively, it's two things. One, it's property tax relief.
Correct.
But two, it's also only for stuff that already exists. So if my area has grown and I need a new high school, this money is only going to pay down debt I have already incurred.
So imagine two big buckets of money.
Yeah.
You've got 521, which is that $1 billion that went out to schools, and that's distributed on average daily attendance. That is for whatever facility needs, either deferred maintenance. They can do whatever they want.
Oh, gotcha.
With it.
That's not going into paying things down.
Correct.
Gotcha.
The 521 bucket can do anything but pay for salaries. Essentially,
Gotcha.
It's got to be a capital project. The school gets to decide what they do. The 292 pot, the House
From
Bill
23.
There it is.
Got it.
That is the one that goes out that's like, buy down your bonds, buy down your levies, and if there's money left over, then that becomes deferred maintenance, projects within the school district, whatever they do.
Gotcha.
But they have to. It dictates that they have to buy down bonds and levies, and that is property tax relief. And these are good efforts. These are bites at the problem that we have. Where we're running into trouble is because the metrics of distribution are going to the schools with the most students. So when you think of your urban centers.
Sure.
But when you look at Boise and Meridian, West Ada, they have a bonding capacity that can get them new buildings. They have a will in the community to pass bonds. They pass their bonds at over a 70% success rate. So what are we doing for the North Gems, going back to that situation, or Salmon School District, like you mentioned? Where they don't have it, they're not getting any meaningful distribution. So I'll give you an example. North Gem, their 292 distribution, remember it has to pay bonds, levies, and then whatever, they got last year $66,000. With their 521, the do whatever you want in the building realm, they got $500,000.
Neither one would do anything meaningful.
Not for new construction.
Okay, so 292. That's the 2023, and that's one like pay down your stuff, pay down your tax relief. Correct. What is their current debt load? Like, what is their current bond load? Because I can't imagine they're walking around with like a $60,000 loan. It's got to be like millions of dollars.
Well, right now they don't have, I mean, I could look up their current bond levy rate, but they don't have a significant load because they can't pass it.
Oh, so it's kind of irrelevant. It's like we don't need the tax relief because we can't get people to agree to a tax hike in the first place.
They need money for a new build.
Okay, so they're like, listen, great, we don't have anything. We can take the $60,000 towards the capital project because we can't pay down any existing bonds anyway.
You know, and the school is going to, for $500,000, they can look at a new roof, you know, an HVAC system. But at some point, you have to ask yourself, are we throwing good money after bad? Are they doing patchwork remediation instead of getting new construction, which is what they need for the next generation of kids in that community?
Right. And we could argue, you can argue like, hey, look, man, patchwork is fine if you have the same, like if you got 10 kids, you don't need a new building for 10 kids. Just keep patching it and paint it and get a new HVAC, get a split pump, heat pump, whatever you want. It doesn't matter to me. But if you have a growing community, right? Or if the cost of maintenance, like a new roof has, like I got to get a new roof. That's not great. I'm not happy about it. And that is really expensive. Sure. Hey, pro tip, by the way, if they slap on solar onto the roof, the federal government will cover the cost of, they will cover a certain portion of the actual solar project, but whatever structure that needs to be built or maintained to install that solar, they will take that, they will apply the same 30% tax credit to that thing. So if somebody out there is like, hey, I need to get a $50,000 roof, maybe consider getting some solar panels on, because then you say it's $50,000, you'll get a 30% tax break off of that $50,000 as well. So you get like $15,000 back. Just a little thing. I don't know.
You sure this current federal government is going to offer that program?
Is going to or currently does. Okay. I don't know I don't know what this afternoon brings. I'm trying to just get a cup of coffee after this conversation. And I don't even know if that's going to happen. So anyway, that's but the bottom line is $500,000 when you're talking about any real building maintenance is like, you're not like, how many kids are in the Salmon School District? Or like North Gem?
North Gem, I think they've got about 200 kids.
Dude, there's no way you're doing anything with a building for 200 kids for $500,000.
No, there's no new construction available to them. But I mean, and we can talk about, there's also issues of declining enrollment in some of our rural communities. Some are seeing increase. I mean, we need to really look at a long-term plan that's going to help address the rural school needs. One way is a better distribution model of either looking at the current needs, like assessment base, right? You assess before you treat who has the most profound needs, what's their capacity to pay for it, how are communities showing skin in the game, right? Salmon School District is like the gold star model for a community that came together, said, we need a building. We don't have the capacity to get it. We know what the threshold that they can, the community can handle, and how can we make it happen? And bless their hearts, they're still 3 million short trying to make it happen. But we've got communities that don't have a lot of options. And if they don't have the property tax to support it, we still have a constitutional obligation to do something. So we could look on needs assessment of how to fund or give some support to those districts that need it the most. We also need to look at our teeny tiny districts if there is a way that we can do some consolidation. Sometimes we have little districts that are, a stone's throw from each other. One county, small capacity, small enrollment in each one, and there's 3 of them. All have administrative staff, all have superintendents, but that would have to be, I think, willingly schools would have to have that discussion. But I feel like there's a temperature in the room right now with school districts to solve some of these problems if given the opportunity. And that's a part of education reform. There's nobody like public educators that can solve a problem when put before them. So we've got to get some better ideas going and figure out a way to help our communities, because rural folks are hurting.
Is there any recourse outside of like seeking, engaging the legal system for school districts? Because it's kind of like, I feel like there should be a phone number you can call. Like, hey guys, like it's me, the Constitution calling, like you owe me this money for this thing. And like, obviously there's not that, but like, do you have to, if I have an obligation, I have to fulfill that obligation without question. And I feel like you would as well. Like, what's the hang up for the school if people are like, hey, we now have $2 billion worth of deferred stuff. And it's our obligation to make sure we have heating and cooling and a roof and like no broken sewer line, right? Like the sewer line blows me away. It's like, how come we didn't have a demo crew there immediately? Like, what is it? Are we leaving it up to the communities to try to solve the constitutional obligation that the state has? Okay, but why? Yeah. I don't understand that. Like, listen, I'm an idiot. I don't, like, you keep saying, yes, you got, like, we have this constitutional obligation, but yes, like, Brian in the community has to agree. And like, I don't know why Brian doesn't agree, but he doesn't agree. Right. And then like, you have the family, it's like, okay, Brian doesn't agree. I understand, but Idaho, you have this obligation. Like, I have little babies that are trying to go to school. You have this obligation. And Brian's like, don't do it. I'm not going to, and nobody knows what Brian's problem is. And Brian, you know, like just doesn't believe in public ed. That's totally fine. But how is it that we're even having this conversation? Because like the obligation stands whether or not Brian agrees. Like, why are we having this conversation?
We're with you. Like this is the issue. This is where it makes my head hurt too, right? And I'm down there every day where we're trying to help articulate what the need is. And rural communities where they are, I mean, very clever with their funding on trying to maximize the biggest return for the money that they get. And they don't have economy of scale, right? They don't have, you know, the per pupil expenditures that they get like in West Ada or in Boise. They just don't have that mass economy to be able to move money around and solve some of the problems. They definitely don't have the bonding capacity, and many of them don't have the votes, the community votes. So to your point, where if local community is like, no, I'm not paying for another school. My kids are grown, you know, I don't have anybody in school, and they don't see the community value of investing in their school. I think rural folks, the schools, the public schools are their school of choice, right? They are the heartbeat of our communities. Everybody goes out to the Friday night football games, things like that. And so we do value them, but we don't have right now the right metric or capacity to meet the need. And so I think when you look at different organizations that are trying to beat the drum about this, is to your point, we have a constitutional obligation. We already have an Idaho Supreme Court ruling on it. We have been taking good bites at it. $1 billion going out through 521 is no small potatoes. But we've scratched the surface, and we have to do a better job of meeting the need. And I'm trying to highlight the rural communities and the need, and that delta that still exists between what they can bring to the table and what is still needed to get them the funding for schools.
Man, there's a lot.
There is a lot.
This is a lot.
Right.
Every day I feel like it's more and more. There's so much when you start peeling it back. I did want to ask you about one more thing. And again, I get your points on this. It makes more sense. It does sound like the state legislature is attempting to move forward. Here's a question for you, actually, before we move. It's my understanding that Idaho can't take on debt. I thought that was the case. Like, how is it that they took on $1 billion? I thought we had to balance our budget and we can't put it on the credit card.
So they created a bond. It's very much like the Garvey bonds that they have through Techum, through to pay for our roads and
Gotcha.
Right. So this is a bond that the state took on with dedicated funds from sales tax. So
gotcha.
In part. And so they're able to bond, and we have excellent credit, right? The state does. And so that bond will go out it's a 10-year bond for $1 billion. And then in 10 years, we'll have to look at it again and see if that's something we want to renew or continue. So we have an obligation to balance our budgets, right? That's what you're talking about. We can't go into debt, but we can bond for what we need. We do that currently. And so that was the model for that was borrowed from the Garvey bonds of something that we utilize right now. I did want to highlight is we are trying to move the conversation on rural school facilities with a piece of legislation. Representative Furness and I got printed this morning in House Ed that establishes a public school facilities grant, which gives preference to rural schools. So it looks at the same things we've been talking about, where there will be an application to where a school can say, here's our bonding capacity, here's our financials, here's how in-kind donations or actual donations from the community, here's what they're willing to, supply looking at what bids are. Here's current construction bids of what we need. Here's the safety and health hazards,
the whole thing.
The whole thing, talk about here's the estimated building cost according to the assessment that we had to do for 521, all of it. And then a committee that would exist in the State Board of Education, they would be able to look at, okay, who reaches top priority based on all of those metrics and how can we help? Is it something like the Salmon School District that needs $3 million to be able to close the deal on that new school because they have done everything possible to have that community buy-in and they got a bond? Or is it looking at North Gem and seeing, maybe we can't afford the whole 20 million with that delta of what they need, but where can we help and how can we get them closer to their goal? And how is their community meeting us, with either halfway or skin in the game? And
when you say a grant, who's supplying the funds for the grant?
So currently there is a one-time pot of grant money called the Cooperative Fund, Public School Cooperative, that was established, you'll like this, after the 2005 Supreme Court ruling where the Idaho Supreme Court said, you're not doing what you need to for facilities. We have to provide something. There was several pieces of legislation that landed in 2006 in response to the court mandate, right? So that fund was meant for hazardous situations with school where there was like an abatement necessary.
Sewage under a cafeteria by chance?
Correct. And so it had $25 million in it and it was underutilized. There was only one school district that went for it, the Plummer-Worley district. And we had heard that it was a cumbersome process. And with that, the state actually took over the spending of it. They took over the authority related to the money that they applied for. So nobody else went for it. So essentially, there's a pot of money one time of $25 million that we're asking get moved into this granting fund. And then we're looking for other sources. We would gladly accept an ongoing appropriation. In the governor's state of the state this year, he made a nod towards rural school facilities, recognizing that there are some communities that cannot, no matter what they do, meet the need for their own school buildings. And so we would, we're open to that conversation, but we would like to establish the fund and see how it goes, right? Can we help meet the needs of some of these communities, either with capital projects or with closing the deal on a new build like Salmon. So that was printed today.
That's awesome. So the 25 million would essentially be, let's say best case scenario, you get 10 schools that all need to close a gap of like $2.5 million.
Sure.
And then you get that money out to them. They do, in fact, execute good faith and good quality result. And then you turn around and say, okay, look, this is the model that we lined up. We had this bucket of money. We used it for these particular things. These are the results. These are the people that were applying. These were the needs. And perhaps fund more, like give us another 25 or give us another 50 or whatever. Maybe there's an ongoing appropriation that allows you to address on a case-by-case basis rural gap closing, bridging that problem, which is like, hey, there's no way, like we have done everything, begged, cheated, stole everything.
Sure.
And we're still like $1.5 million short. It's like, okay, here's your $1.5 million. And you have to establish that you have tapped every single resource, that you've asked every single person, that perhaps even that there's a certain amount of community buy-in outside of voting for bonds. It's like, okay, people are donating X number of dollars out of their own pocket. Like that's a huge ask as well. But that would essentially be it, which is you've gotten as far as you can. Like there's nowhere else to go. And this is an obligation that we have. So there's your last little piece.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We'll bring you down for the hearing.
God bless it. I'd love it. Awesome. Listen, I have a bunch of questions. You'll have to come back because I know it's a working day. You took time out. You have all this information. We've talked about a really in-depth and important piece, which is, again, funding for rural schools, which ultimately, and not to make this a school choice thing, but it's my understanding that ultimately the school choice will not benefit rural schools nearly as much as it would benefit more urbanized schools, right? So people that are saying like, hey, we don't even have a tax base to increase like one school building. It's like They likely don't have a lot of private schools floating around. Online private school options, I don't think those do a very good job just from an educator standpoint, and I think from a statistical standpoint. But bottom line is like school choice is not going to address this. So for people that may say, well, like this is an argument for school choice, we just need to liberate the free market. It's like there's not an existing infrastructure or like marketplace in general in rural areas that say have like 200 students for like a robust private school.
Right. And I mean, and I know that's a different conversation entirely, but again, our rural communities will be put in a place of subsidizing urban centers that have the private school options. So there's only about 115 private schools in the state of Idaho, and you could probably guess where they're centralized. It's going to be in Kootenai County. It's going to be some in eastern Idaho, but a lot of them are in the Treasure Valley. And so folks that are in Mackay or folks that are in Bancroft or folks that are, far removed, they have to ask themselves, do they want their tax dollars going to subsidize a private school in Boise?
That is an important question, and you don't want to, these are obviously, West Ada is very successful at getting bonds and whatnot. Mm-hmm. And I also know it's like every time I turn around, somebody's opening another private school, and it's like, 3 days on, 2 days off, or, whatever the organization might be, which is bonkers as well, because, not only do you have a lot of people bailing, it's not bonkers that people are leaving the private school or public school. There are a lot of people that have expressed dislike for whatever reason. And it's like, that's fine. That's on them. Like, I have no opinion about that, good or bad or the other. But it is interesting because this is hyper focused in an area that has like Galileo, right? School of choice that has a 99% math proficiency in 8th grade. So if you want to look at public school done well, mm-hmm. right? From a quantitative standpoint, like you cannot beat the schools that West Ada has in a public or private setting. Like nobody beats them, even charter schools. And then if you want to look at it from a cultural dynamic, West Ada years ago already passed an policy ordinance. I don't know. It's like a policy. I can't remember. Policy ordinance legislate. Like I'm a mess.
Yeah.
Anyway, passed a policy that Representative Hill's bill about flags in classrooms. They passed that years ago. Like you can only have the Idaho flag, Idaho State flag and the United States flag in classrooms. They ironed out bathrooms. They removed books ahead of any requirement from the state. Like they've started going down. So from a cultural standpoint, if that's something that's really, I know a lot of people are worried about that. Mm-hmm. They're like, hey, I don't want, my kid exposed to whatever it might be. West Ada is also doing that. So it's like from a quantifiable, academic metric standpoint, they crush. And then from a cultural conservative sentiment, it's like they're also doing everything people would want. And it's interesting that even in the presence of all of that, you have these private schools, blooming out of nowhere. That it's like, okay, so it's not the conservative culture, that like kind of sterilized neutral classrooms. It's not the quantifiable value of the academics. It's like, it's something else. I don't know. It's an interesting thing that I keep looking at. It's like, wow, this is like.
What I hear you highlighting there is the power of local control. So when we talk about how incredible school districts are at solving the problems that, are before them, meeting the needs of kids and families, teaching academics, navigating facility needs and cultural politics and all the things, public schools do an incredible job. So that local control, allowing a district to solve the issues in its community as it sees fit and as that matches their priorities, makes a lot of sense. With private schools, people have every right to seek out that personal choice for their student and whether they want religious or a magnet school that's all STEM related or whatever it is. Sure. But the question before us is, do all taxpayers in Idaho get to subsidize that choice? That's the question that we have to answer.
Gotcha. So. Representative Galaviz, I appreciate you. Thank you for making the time today. Thank you for coming in. Let's do this again, and let's do an update on whether or not you can get the $25 million for your bill.
We're working on it. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.